The question arrived like a bolt of lightning. Why did the royal family choose that exact day to draw a line so sharp, so final, that it pushed two of its most talked-about figures out of the royal orbit entirely? It wasn't a rumor. It wasn't a misinterpretation. It was a rare moment when Buckingham Palace itself stepped forward and declared that the crown had reached its threshold. And behind the velvet curtains, where tradition meets strategic calculation, something far more deliberate was unfolding. The truth, at least the truth shaped within the palace walls, was that this was never really about individuals. Not solely about Andrew's long-shadowed associations. Not solely about Meghan's controversial network of acquaintances that suddenly appeared under a harsher spotlight. What happened that morning was the revelation of a decision that had been simmering for months. A decision forged by pressure, perception, and a monarchy determined not to be defined by anyone's past but its own future. In that brief broadcast, King Charles wasn't just making an announcement. He was sending a message to the world. The crown would no longer allow any lingering cloud, however indirect, however symbolic, to drift above its carefully guarded image. The institution had chosen survival over sentiment, clarity over hesitation. William and Catherine, long viewed as the next steady hands of the monarchy, became the silent axis around which this dramatic shift turned. And the palace needed the global audience to understand one thing unmistakably. The future of the monarchy was being rebuilt in real time. The removal of Andrew and Meghan, though vastly different in context, became twin symbols of that reconstruction. Andrew's situation had been a slow-burning crisis, resurfacing with force after freshly resurfaced documents ignited public doubt again. Meghan's case was different yet equally volatile, shaped not by accusation but by the widening echo of past associations and the intense scrutiny that followed. Both stories collided in one sweeping decision, a single red line drawn across decades of royal history. So the answer to the opening question is simple, yet immense in weight. This was a strategic reset, a recalibration of the monarchy's moral compass, and a deliberate repositioning of William and Catherine as the guardians of a new era. Whether the world agrees or not, the palace had spoken, and the echo is only just beginning. Dawn broke over Buckingham Palace with a strange stillness, the kind that settles over a place just before something irreversible happens. Staff members moved through the corridors with a practiced calm, yet their eyes betrayed a deeper tension. Everyone knew this was not a routine day. The air felt heavy, as though the walls themselves were bracing for the weight of a message that would ripple far beyond the palace gates. Inside the Crimson Drawing Room, where countless royal speeches had been prepared across generations, King Charles stood in front of the tall windows, studying the slate-gray sky. He held the draft of his statement in his hands, though he had already memorized every line. Nothing in the text had been left to chance. Every word had been polished, debated, reframed, a verbal fortress meant to withstand the storm waiting outside. Behind him, advisors whispered in low tones, adjusting last-minute language, rehearsing responses to the inevitable questions, and reviewing contingency plans. No one dared to break the quiet mood surrounding the king. They understood the significance of what he was about to do. This was not an announcement. It was a turning point, a course correction, a statement that would define not just his reign, but the legacy of the institution itself. For months, buried beneath discussions about modernization and public trust, a deeper undercurrent had been building, one that urged the monarchy to step out of the shadow of old controversies and into a narrative of renewed integrity. In the hours leading up to the announcement, the palace operated like a well-coordinated command center. Communications teams monitored global news cycles, ensuring the timing would land with maximum clarity but minimal distortion. Legal experts stood by, ready to interpret the statement's careful phrasing for international media. Courtiers moved briskly through the halls, carrying sealed envelopes, briefing packets, and updated copies of the speech, marked with subtle edits. No detail was too small to reconsider. Even the setting, a simple desk, a muted backdrop, a portrait of Queen Elizabeth placed discreetly behind, had been chosen to anchor the moment in continuity while signaling decisive change. Charles himself remained quiet, contemplative. Those who observed him noted a seriousness that differed from his usual public composure. There was resolve in his posture, but also the unmistakable weight of a man who understood the emotional fracture this decision would create within his own family. Yet he also understood the greater fracture that would follow if he failed to act. An institution built on symbolism simply cannot allow its symbols to crack. Outside, the public had no idea what was coming. Rumors had circulated for weeks, whispers about new documents, renewed scrutiny, and the palace's growing impatience with unfinished stories from the past. But no one expected the king to step forward with such directness. Not in this era of careful wording and strategic ambiguity, but the truth was that the palace had reached its threshold. The swirling narratives around Andrew and Meghan had grown too vast, too unpredictable, too capable of overshadowing the royal agenda. Something had to be done to halt the tide. Within the palace staff, reactions varied. Some viewed the coming announcement as overdue, a necessary act of self-preservation. Others, especially those who had served under Queen Elizabeth, struggled with the idea of a public severing of ties. Loyalty had always been a pillar of royal tradition. Yet loyalty, unchecked, could become an anchor pulling the institution into waters too deep to escape. As the clock neared the scheduled hour, the palace tightened. Security teams swept the broadcast room. Technicians checked audio feeds and lighting angles. Advisors took their final positions, standing just beyond the camera's edge. A hush washed through the hallways. The kind of hush that signals history is lining up, waiting to be spoken aloud. Charles stepped forward. One of his aides noticed the faintest pause as he placed his hand on the polished wood of the desk. It was not hesitation. It felt more like acknowledgement, a silent recognition of the moment he was about to shape. When he looked up, his expression had settled into something resolute, almost austere. The cameras flickered on. The red light blinked. And just like that, the day that had begun with quiet tension transformed into one that would be dissected, debated, and remembered for years. Inside Buckingham Palace, as the king's voice carried through the halls, even those who already knew the contents of the speech felt a chill. Because hearing the words spoken aloud gave the moment a finality that no written draft could. By the time the broadcast ended, the palace stood suspended between relief and uncertainty. The line had been drawn. The world would soon react. But for now, in the echo of that historic morning, one thing was clear. The monarchy had crossed into a new chapter, and there was no turning back. Prince Andrew's downfall did not begin on the morning King Charles drew the fateful red line. It had been unfolding slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, like a crack creeping across the surface of a centuries-old mirror. Those within the palace often described it as an inevitable drift, a quiet descent accelerated by decisions made long before 2025. But the final push, the moment that transformed simmering discomfort into unavoidable action, arrived unexpectedly, carried in the form of freshly resurfaced communications that reignited questions the palace had hoped were finally fading. The email trove over 20,000 pages did not accuse Andrew of new wrongdoing, but it did something arguably more damaging. It blurred the line between distancing and denial. Within the correspondence were exchanges that contradicted earlier assurances, suggesting continued contact far later than the public had been led to believe. It wasn't the content itself that created the crisis. It was the perception, the idea that the narrative carefully constructed in recent years might not have matched the full picture unsettled not only the media, but the palace machinery that depends on public trust like oxygen. Inside royal offices, advisors pored over the material with growing unease. They understood the cruel mechanics of public opinion. Once a doubt resurfaces, it does not simply fade again. It expands, finds new angles, invites speculation, and soon becomes its own living storm. Those storms, once unleashed, rarely spare the institution standing at the center. Andrew's situation was no longer a single branch weighed down by winter frost. It was becoming the kind of burden that threatened the entire tree. Charles, ever mindful of image and responsibility, struggled with the emotional toll. Andrew was not merely a royal figure. He was a brother, yet the king had inherited not only the crown, but the responsibility to guard its reputation at all costs. In private conversations, his conflict was visible. He paced rooms, reread reports, asked advisors to walk him through potential consequences again and again. But each discussion returned to the same conclusion. The palace could not continue navigating a story with shifting shadows. If Charles hesitated out of familial loyalty, William did not. The Prince of Wales had long sensed that Andrew's lingering ties, even if indirect, even if historical, were reshaping how younger generations viewed the monarchy itself. William saw the institution not as a static relic, but as something that must be pruned to survive the harsh climate of modern scrutiny. Those close to him recall his blunt assessment. The monarchy cannot protect what weakens it. Catherine shared this perspective quietly but firmly, concerned not only for the present image of the crown but the one her children would inherit. Advisors recall her saying in private that clarity, however painful, was preferable to allowing a long shadow to stretch across the next generation. The pressure mounted as headlines grew sharper. International outlets revisited years-old narratives, and political commentators began openly questioning whether Andrew's presence, even in retirement, undermined the crown's moral message. By autumn, the palace found itself trapped in a cycle it could not escape. Each attempt to maintain distance only fueled more speculation. Silence no longer seemed measured, it seemed evasive. Andrew himself sensed the shifting winds. At Royal Lodge, his residence that had increasingly become both sanctuary and reminder of isolation, he attempted to negotiate for a middle path, some form of symbolic position, a softened transition, a retained courtesy title. Insiders say he pleaded his case with emotion, insisting he had followed the palace's guidance and stayed out of public life. But the decision had passed the point of compromise. Too many eyes were watching. Too many questions had resurfaced. Too much trust was at stake. When Charles finally informed Andrew of the course he would take, the conversation was described as quiet, controlled, and devastatingly final. There was no anger, only inevitability. Charles allegedly spoke with the calm of a man who had agonized over every angle and found no alternative that protected the crown. Those who witnessed Andrew's reaction recalled the shock not of guilt, but of realization. The loss of titles was not just administrative. It was the severing of the identity he had carried since birth. The news, once public, landed with the force of a long-expected but nonetheless jarring blow. Some felt relief, believing accountability had arrived at last. Others felt sympathy, seeing a man whose missteps had eclipsed the entirety of his life's work. But in one crucial sense, the reaction did not matter. What mattered was that the monarchy had finally acted. Andrew's fall, shaped by years of erosion, had reached its irreversible end. Within Buckingham Palace, this moment was interpreted as more than an individual consequence. It was a statement of recalibration, an assertion that the institution would no longer carry the weight of lingering controversies from the past. And though Andrew had become the central figure in this chapter, everyone understood he was not the only one affected by the storm that had gathered over the years. His removal marked the first strike in a broader, deeper shift. The monarchy was changing, and the next name on the list would ignite an even larger fire. Meghan Markle's inclusion in King Charles's sweeping announcement sent a tremor through the public that even seasoned royal observers had not anticipated. Unlike Andrew, whose long unfolding troubles had cast a persistent shadow, Meghan had always existed in a charged space, admired by some as a symbol of modernity, questioned by others for the turbulence that seemed to follow her departure from royal life. Yet nothing prepared the world for the moment her name appeared beside Andrew's in the same solemn declaration. It was not a comparison of deeds, it was a comparison of consequences, and that distinction ignited an international firestorm. The palace knew Meghan's chapter was far more complex. She had never been accused of any direct misconduct, but her past social circles, glittering, elite, and deeply intertwined with Hollywood's upper tiers, had recently resurfaced under a harsher, more unforgiving spotlight. When the trove of documents connected to Epstein's estate exploded into public view, Meghan's name did not appear in accusations, but in the margins, guest lists, overlapping acquaintances, shared event spaces, and moments from an earlier life, now reinterpreted under an entirely different lens. What had once been innocuous networking events suddenly took on new context in a world obsessed with tracing lines between proximity and implication. Inside Buckingham Palace, the issue was never about direct involvement. It was about optics. Symbols carry power in the monarchy, and perception often outweighs fact. Senior advisors worried that ignoring Meghan's indirect connections while publicly addressing Andrew's would create an appearance of selective judgment. That inconsistency, they feared, could fracture public trust more deeply than silence ever had. Modern audiences no longer distinguish cleanly between legal innocence and reputational entanglement. Narratives are shaped by association, speculation, and the relentless momentum of social media. This pressure collided head-on with Meghan's own public brand, one built meticulously around empowerment, philanthropy, and global advocacy. The palace hesitated, aware that any reference to her name alongside Andrew's would trigger backlash not only from her supporters, but from anyone who viewed her as a cultural or racial symbol. Yet the more advisors debated, the more apparent it became that omission was impossible. The crown could not appear to overlook inconsistencies simply because addressing them was uncomfortable. In Montecito, the announcement landed like a thunderclap. Meghan and Harry were reportedly stunned not by the palace distancing itself, which they had privately expected at some point, but by the phrasing. The term grave breach of trust struck them as a public rebuke, draped in ceremonial language. Meghan's statement arrived within hours, polished, emphatic, and fueled by indignation. She framed the decision as retaliation for her previous criticisms of the institution, a narrative her supporters amplified instantly. Her spokesperson went further, describing the move as a calculated attempt to silence a woman who refused to follow the script. Harry, caught between loyalty to his wife and the vestiges of loyalty to his father, struggled. Sources close to the couple claimed he attempted to speak directly with Charles but was told the king would not be taking calls regarding the matter. For Harry, it must have felt like a familiar door closing once again. For Meghan, it became evidence that the monarchy's announcement was less about values and more about punishment. Public reaction broke into distinct camps. America largely rallied behind Meghan, viewing the decision as excessive and emotionally charged. In the UK, the response was colder, shaped by years of strained relations and unresolved wounds from past interviews and memoirs. Commonwealth nations offered yet another mosaic of interpretations, some sympathetic, others weary of royal drama, overshadowing diplomatic priorities. Inside the palace, the atmosphere remained tense but resolute. Advisors insisted that the decision was strategic, not personal, a necessary act of clarity in a world where even indirect associations could compromise the crown's message. They pointed to the future, William and Catherine, whose steady public image was becoming the monarchy's strongest anchor. Allowing unresolved narratives about Meghan to drift unaddressed risked muting the signal of that new era. For all the debate, one truth emerged clearly from the November declaration. Meghan's chapter within the House of Windsor had not ended quietly. It had ended dramatically, irrevocably, and in a way that ensured she would remain a focal point of royal discussion long after her title disappeared from official record. Her story was no longer intertwined with royal duties, but with the broader question of how a centuries-old institution manages the narratives of those who step outside its walls, yet continue to shape its legacy. Behind Buckingham Palace's gilded facade, the decision that would shake the monarchy was not born from a single conversation, but from a series of intense, meticulously choreographed meetings deep within its most restricted chambers. The public saw only the final broadcast, calm, measured, resolute. But inside the palace, the atmosphere leading up to that moment was more akin to a high-stakes strategy room than a ceremonial institution. King Charles, long known for his careful temperament, found himself navigating the most consequential test of his reign. How to restore moral clarity to an institution confronted by shadows, stretching further than anyone expected. The first meeting took place days after the email trove exploded across international headlines. Charles was briefed before dawn. Advisors placed thick folders before him, their contents marked with tabs, annotations, and urgent recommendations. What unsettled the king was not the specifics. They were familiar echoes of old storms, but the realization that public perception had shifted violently overnight. What once seemed manageable now appeared like a tide threatening to engulf the palace entirely. Those who knew Charles well said he listened in near silence, absorbing the implications with the expression of a man who fully understood the magnitude of what lay ahead. Over the next week, discussions grew more intense. The palace's most trusted figures, its legal minds, communications, strategists, and senior courtiers gathered repeatedly behind closed doors. Every angle was dissected with almost surgical precision. They debated not only the legal considerations, but the symbolism of inaction. One advisor described the meetings as a slow peeling back of denial, a recognition that the monarchy was being pulled into narratives it could no longer hope to control unless it made a decisive move. The conversations were not fueled by panic, but by a sobering awareness that the crown's authority was rooted not in force, but in the perception of integrity. Charles's internal conflict became apparent early on. As king, he had a duty to safeguard the monarchy's long-term stability. As a father and brother, he felt the emotional weight of what such drastic action would mean. Those close to him say he often paused during briefings, staring at the documents before him, with a look that blended sorrow and determination. The legacy of Queen Elizabeth, her unwavering loyalty to family, her quiet handling of crises hovered over every decision. But Charles's reign was different. He faced a world that demanded transparency, a media landscape that magnified every misstep, and a public far less forgiving of ambiguity. In these strategic sessions, William emerged as a driving force. His perspective was stark, pragmatic, and rooted in a belief that the monarchy could no longer afford mixed signals. He viewed the crown as an institution that must evolve quickly, or risk losing the next generation entirely. His stance reportedly shaped the tone of the debates, pushing advisors to confront realities they might otherwise have softened. Catherine's influence, though quieter, carried an equally profound impact. She approached the situation through the lens of legacy, what her children would inherit, how history would view the choices made now, and which values would define the institution moving forward. Advisors later recalled her expressing that difficult decisions were the cost of preserving a cleaner path for the future. Not everyone in the palace agreed. Queen Camilla approached the issue with a cautious, almost protective instinct. She worried that such a firm public stance could expose the family to renewed scrutiny, or ignite conflicts that had been quietly contained. Her concerns were heard, respected, but ultimately outweighed by the emerging consensus that delaying action risked turning a controllable crisis into a defining one. The final decision took shape during a late-night meeting that ran past midnight. By then, the tone in the room had shifted from debate to acceptance. Charles reviewed the draft of his speech for the last time. Every sentence had been weighed sharp enough to signal accountability, but measured enough to avoid accusations. The monarchy would not point fingers. It would simply draw the line and move forward. When the meeting ended, Charles remained seated, long after his advisors had left the room. Those who passed the corridor later said the king looked steadier than he had all week, not relieved, not triumphant, but resolved. The strategy was set, the message crafted, the institution aligned. And the next morning, when Charles stepped before the camera and spoke the words that would echo across the world, he was not the hesitant man who began the week of deliberations. He was a monarch who had made his choice and accepted its consequences. The moment King Charles's announcement aired, the reaction was instantaneous, global, and electric. It was as if the world had been holding its breath, waiting for clarity from a monarchy long entangled in speculation. And suddenly, the dam burst. Within minutes, television networks cut into scheduled programming. News presenters spoke with a mix of astonishment and urgency, trying to capture the weight of what had just unfolded. It wasn't just a royal statement, it was the kind of proclamation that rewrites narratives, reshapes alliances, and ignites arguments across continents. In the UK, the headlines arrived like rolling thunder. Tabloids splashed bold phrases across front pages before journalists had even finished typing their first paragraphs. Some praised the decision as a necessary act of moral courage. Others dissected every word, looking for hints of bias or hidden motives. On social media, the split was even sharper. X erupted with competing hashtags, each pulling the story into different ideological or emotional frames. For a full 72 hours, the public square became a battlefield of interpretations. Supporters of the monarchy called it a long overdue reset. Meghan's defenders framed it as a punitive move wrapped in institutional formality. International activists, commentators, and celebrities chimed in, turning the situation into a referendum not just on the individuals involved, but on the monarchy itself. In America, the tone shifted dramatically. Meghan had long held a polarizing but powerful presence in U.S. media, and her inclusion in the king's statement sparked immediate backlash. American talk shows debated whether the move was an assertion of accountability or an attempt to silence a woman who had stepped outside traditional boundaries. One influential commentator claimed the decision felt less like a correction and more like a warning shot aimed across the Atlantic. Meanwhile, in Hollywood, Meghan's name resurfaced in conversations about narrative control, symbolism, and how institutions respond when public figures refuse to conform. Across the Commonwealth, reactions became a barometer of shifting loyalties. In Jamaica, political leaders already moving toward removing the British monarch as head of state interpreted the announcement as both a moment of reckoning and a reminder of the monarchy's complex legacy. In Australia, constitutional scholars and media outlets held impassioned debates about whether this was a sign of refreshing modernity or an outdated system exerting old-world power. Canada, often the quiet middle ground, found itself unusually divided. Editorials questioned whether the monarchy's moral authority should extend to perceptions formed from distant social connections. Citizens who had long felt ambivalent toward the crown suddenly found themselves analyzing the decision with unexpected intensity. Inside London's political sphere, the announcement had ripple effects that no one fully predicted. The British government, seeking stability amid economic concerns and rising nationalism, offered measured support. Yet opposition members seized the opportunity to question the broader implications. If the monarchy was willing to reshape its ranks publicly, what did that imply about its influence behind closed doors? Was this a sign of institutional strength or desperation? Parliament did not formally intervene, but the conversations it sparked were unmistakably shaped by the public's reaction. Meanwhile, inside Buckingham Palace, the emotional aftermath was more subdued but no less tense. Staff members felt the tremor of what had occurred, aware that they were working inside a building now under wider scrutiny than ever. Official communication protocols tightened overnight. Personal comments, even casual ones, were discouraged. Everything had to be routed through the communications office. The palace had gone into a defensive crouch, not out of fear, but out of recognition that the days ahead would be filled with escalating narratives, intense questioning, and unpredictable shifts in global conversation. And yet, beneath the firestorm, some advisors felt a quiet sense of purpose. The decision, controversial as it was, had reasserted the monarchy's ability to take decisive action. It had signaled that the institution was no longer willing to allow lingering controversies or fragmented loyalties to dictate its image. But others inside those same walls whispered lingering doubts. Would the public interpret the king's clarity as strength, or as a sign that the monarchy had been forced into a corner? Would the world see decisiveness or vulnerability? And even more pressing, would this bold move calm the storm, or had it only sharpened the winds for what was to come? In the days following the announcement, Buckingham Palace shifted into a state that staff members privately described as disciplined silence. The shockwave had passed, but the air remained charged as though everyone understood that the institution was standing on newly drawn ground and that even the smallest misstep could disturb the balance Charles had just created. The monarchy, so often portrayed as timeless and unchanging, suddenly felt malleable, reshaping itself in response to pressures that could no longer be ignored. Behind the scenes, a quiet restructuring began. Staff meetings grew more frequent, more focused. Senior advisors emphasized the need for consistency and clarity, not just in public messaging, but in daily operations. There was a renewed insistence that every appearance, statement, and initiative reflect the values the king had just reaffirmed. For the first time in years, the palace felt less like a ceremonial machine and more like an institution preparing for long-term reinvention. One of the most notable shifts occurred in the management of royal engagements. Patronages that had existed out of tradition rather than impact were reviewed. Several minor royals were informed that future funding from the sovereign grant would be reduced or discontinued. The message, though unspoken, was unmistakable. The era of expansive royal roles was ending. A smaller, more purposeful monarchy was taking shape, one that would depend heavily on William and Catherine, whose steadiness had become the quiet axis of royal stability. Catherine, in particular, emerged as a central figure in this internal recalibration. Her projects in early childhood development and mental health were suddenly elevated, framed as the moral backbone of the monarchy's forward path. William's environmental campaigns, too, gained renewed visibility, with advisors subtly positioning the couple not only as heirs to the throne, but as the embodiment of the institution's ethical evolution. Their public image measured, empathetic, unburdened by scandal, became the standard against which future royal conduct would be judged. But beneath the surface, not everyone adjusted easily. Palace staff reported a noticeable tension in corridors normally defined by routine. Long-serving aides, still influenced by the gentler crisis management style of Queen Elizabeth's era, struggled with the abruptness of the new approach. Some felt the decision to remove Andrew and Meghan had been necessary. Others feared it had set a precedent of public severity that might haunt the institution later. A few whispered whether clarity had been achieved at the cost of compassion. Even within the family, quiet fractures deepened. The absence of Andrew from official documents and planning sessions became a silent reminder of the monarchy's new direction. His removal changed the internal dynamic, leaving gaps in roles, residences, and traditions that had existed for decades. Meghan's exclusion, though geographically distant, created ripples of its own. Her supporters fueled narratives that the palace had acted harshly, and those stories inevitably floated back into royal circles, stirring discomfort and disagreement. Yet despite the unease, one truth became increasingly clear. The monarchy was committed to its new foundation. Charles's decision had not been a momentary gesture. It signaled a shift toward institutional self-preservation, a willingness to endure criticism in exchange for a stronger, cleaner image. The palace was no longer navigating its future in the shadow of past scandals. It was attempting to redefine itself for a generation that demanded transparency, accountability, and purpose. Whether this new discipline would fortify the monarchy or expose deeper vulnerabilities remained uncertain. But for now, within the quiet halls of Buckingham Palace, the House of Windsor had accepted its new reality, a reality shaped not by tradition alone, but by the choices it had made in the wake of a defining storm. In the wake of the palace's seismic decision, one truth rose unmistakably from the debris. The center of gravity within the House of Windsor had shifted. For years, William and Catherine had been seen as the future polished, steady, carefully shielded from controversy. But after the November announcement, they were no longer simply heirs waiting their turn. They had become the quiet architects of a new royal era, the stabilizing force around which the monarchy now quietly revolved. The public sensed the shift almost instantly. In the days that followed, newspapers and broadcasters began framing the couple not as supporting figures, but as the moral anchor of the institution. Their work, once described in gentle, ceremonial terms, was suddenly analyzed with the seriousness usually reserved for heads of state. William's environmental initiatives, once praised as admirable side efforts, took on new strategic significance. Catherine's long-running projects in childhood development and mental health were reframed as essential pillars in rebuilding public trust. Their calm, composed presence stood in stark contrast to the turbulence swirling around the monarchy, offering the public a glimpse of what the crown could look like when aligned with clarity and purpose. Inside the palace, their influence became even more apparent. Senior advisors, some of whom had served multiple generations of monarchs, began treating William not just as the future king, but as a partner in shaping the present. Decisions about which engagements to prioritize, where to allocate resources, and how to position the monarchy in a skeptical digital world increasingly aligned with his vision. Catherine's voice carried equal weight, not through force, but through consistency. She approached each initiative with the same unwavering focus she had demonstrated for over a decade: measured, quiet, deeply intentional. One advisor remarked privately that Catherine had become the institution's compass, guiding decisions toward values rather than optics. Public affection for the couple surged. Surveys conducted in the weeks following the announcement showed a notable rise in support, not for the monarchy as a whole, but for William and Catherine specifically. They represented stability in a moment of upheaval, a generational bridge connecting tradition with modern expectations. Their family, George, Charlotte, and Louis, became symbols of continuity, innocence, and the hope that the next chapter of the monarchy might be written without the burdens that overshadowed its past. Even those undecided about the relevance of the crown found themselves acknowledging the couple's ability to distill the institution down to its most human, relatable elements. Yet beneath the optimism, there was also pressure. With Andrew and Meghan removed from the official narrative, William and Catherine's roles expanded quietly but significantly. They were expected to shoulder more engagements, more responsibility, more scrutiny. The future of the monarchy would be measured by their ability to uphold the values Charles had articulated: duty, clarity, moral steadiness. Their every gesture would be interpreted as a sign of the institution's direction. Still, those close to the couple noticed something else emerging: a sense of resolve. William, shaped by years of observing the monarchy's fragility from behind palace walls, understood the responsibility before him. Catherine, who had always balanced public duty with private devotion, seemed even more centered. Together, they radiated a quiet certainty that this turbulent moment was not merely a crisis, but an opportunity, a chance to redefine what the monarchy stood for. As the dust settled, one sentiment echoed through British media, social networks, and the quiet corridors of the palace. The future of the crown no longer rested on the grandeur of tradition, but on the steadiness of two individuals whose greatest power came not from their titles, but from the trust they had earned. Whether this trust would endure the tests ahead remained to be seen. But in this moment, William and Catherine stood unmistakably at the heart of a monarchy, stepping into a new era, one shaped by purpose, tempered by experience, and illuminated by the hope of renewal. The palace's announcement had echoed across continents, sparking debates, headlines, and emotional reckonings. But as the dust began to settle, a deeper truth emerged, one that reached beyond the fate of Andrew or Meghan, beyond the storm of commentary and the roar of social networks. The monarchy had crossed into a new chapter, one defined not by crisis, but by the choices made in its aftermath. What unfolded was less a moment of punishment and more a deliberate act of self-preservation, a recalibration of values in an age where public trust had become its most fragile asset. Within Buckingham Palace, this shift was felt immediately. The atmosphere changed, conversations sharpened, and priorities realigned. There was a collective understanding that the monarchy would be judged not only by the decision itself, but by what followed. A symbolic line had been drawn, and everything the institution did from here forward would either reinforce it or erode it. King Charles had taken the first step, but it was William and Catherine who now carried the quiet responsibility of shaping what the monarchy would become. Their presence, steady and unflashy, became the new emotional anchor for the public. They represented not grandeur, but reassurance, a reminder that the monarchy could adapt without losing its essence. The crown's future now rested not on ceremony, but on credibility. In that sense, the November announcement was not an ending. It was the clearing of a path. But questions lingered in the air, carried on the breath of commentators, whispered in political chambers, and debated in Commonwealth capitals. Had the monarchy regained control of its narrative, or had it simply revealed how vulnerable that narrative had always been? Would the firm stance taken in this moment strengthen the institution for decades, or would it set expectations that might be impossible to sustain? Even within the palace walls, where silence often speaks louder than words, these uncertainties drifted through conversations. Outside, the global audience watched closely. For some, The monarchy's actions signaled long overdue accountability. For others, they illuminated the complexities of an institution, trying to balance legacy with modernity. And for many, the decision raised a simple but profound question. What does the monarchy stand for in an era that challenges every old symbol, every inherited tradition, every quiet assumption about power? And so, the story returns to the central figures who will determine the answers. William and Catherine, protectors of continuity, bearers of a gentler but firmer vision, stand at the threshold of a redefined monarchy. Their actions, their choices, and the values they embody will shape how history remembers this turning point. Perhaps the real question now is not why the king acted, but what comes next. Will the monarchy's bold step become the foundation of a modern renaissance? Or is it merely the calm before another storm, one waiting just beyond the horizon, where old expectations meet new realities? The only certainty is that the world will be watching. If you want to follow this unfolding journey and dive deeper into the hidden dynamics shaping this new royal chapter, make sure to subscribe, leave your thoughts in the comments, and stay with me as we explore what comes next.